The encounter in the streets. On a warm summer afternoon, the busy streets of the city were filled with people rushing about, each wrapped up in their own lives. The air was thick with the sounds of car horns, people chatting, and the distant hum of the city. Among the crowd, a well-dressed man walked briskly. His suit was expensive, his shoes polished to a shine, and his face held an air of superiority, as if the world belonged to him. The man's name was Richard, but everyone around him simply called him Rich. He worked in a high-rise office building, surrounded by wealth and power. He always carried himself with confidence, or perhaps arrogance. People like him were used to being on top, never having to worry about the struggles of everyday life. To Rich, those who didn't have money or status were just another part of the city's background, like the stray dogs that roamed the streets. As he walked down the sidewalk, something caught his eye. On the corner of the street, near a small park bench, sat a man dressed in tattered clothes. His hair was messy, his beard unkempt, and his face was lined with the hardships of life on the streets. The man, a homeless black man, was hunched over, clutching a worn-out jacket around himself as he sat quietly. His eyes were tired, but there was a strange calmness about him. Rich slowed his pace as he passed the man. He noticed the man's worn shoes and the dirt that covered his skin. Without thinking, Rich smirked, muttering under his breath, "Another one of these beggars, just taking up space." He didn't even bother to look back as he continued walking. But the words stuck with him. He had been walking down the same streets for years, but every day he saw people like the homeless man, sitting in the same spots, doing nothing but asking for handouts. To him, they were just lazy, trying to get by with as little effort as possible. Rich couldn't help but feel a sense of superiority as he thought, "I worked hard to get where I am. Why can't they do the same?" But as he kept walking, something about that man stuck in his mind. He hadn't even looked at him directly, but Rich could feel his gaze on him as he passed. It was like the man knew something Rich didn't. There was a strange intensity in those tired eyes, as though the homeless man was seeing right through him. Rich shook off the feeling and carried on with his day, but that look lingered deep in the back of his mind. Later that afternoon, Rich sat in a cafe, enjoying a cup of coffee and scrolling through his phone. He was telling a story to his friends, laughing about the people he saw on the streets. "Some people have no shame," he said. "They just sit there, doing nothing, waiting for someone to give them something. It's pathetic, really." His friends chuckled, agreeing with him. "Yeah, they'll never get anywhere in life," one of them added. Rich nodded, pleased that everyone saw things his way. He had always prided himself on being successful and hardworking, believing that the world worked in a way where only the strong survive. And in his eyes, people like the homeless man were weak. They were just too lazy or too broken to make something of themselves. But as he finished his coffee and prepared to leave, something unexpected happened. He stood up and turned around. And there, standing at the door of the cafe, was the same homeless man he had passed earlier. The man was no longer hunched over or sitting on the ground. He stood tall, his clothes now much cleaner, and his expression was calm, almost regal. Rich blinked in surprise. For a moment, he thought he was seeing things. Was it the same person? He squinted and took another look. Yes, it was the man. But he looked completely different now. The ragged clothes were gone, replaced by a well-tailored suit. His face was no longer weathered and tired. It had a sense of confidence, the kind Rich himself carried. He looked out of place in a way, as though he didn't belong in this part of the world. The homeless man, now standing confidently, locked eyes with Rich. The smile on the man's face was not one of mockery, but of understanding. It was as if the man knew something that Rich didn't. He didn't say anything, but his presence alone made Rich uneasy. The smile was too knowing, too calm. Rich's heart raced for a moment, and he quickly turned away, not wanting to make eye contact. What is going on? Rich thought to himself, his mind racing. The homeless man was now standing in front of him, dressed in fine clothes, and for the first time, Rich felt the power shift. He felt small. He was used to being the one who looked down on others, the one who always had the upper hand. But now, he couldn't shake the feeling that this man had something he didn't. The homeless man gave a slight nod and turned to leave. As he did, he glanced back at Rich one last time, and with that single look, Rich's world seemed to shift. Little did Rich know, this encounter would change his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The man who he had dismissed as a beggar on the streets had just begun to teach him a lesson that he would never forget. The unexpected lesson. Rich couldn't shake the strange feeling from his encounter with the homeless man. That look, that knowing smile, it lingered in his mind long after the man had left the cafe. He couldn't help but wonder what had just happened. Was he imagining things? The man had looked so ordinary, just like the hundreds of other homeless people Rich had seen before. Yet there was something different about him. Something unsettling. Later that evening, as Rich lay in bed, tossing and turning, the image of the man in the suit kept appearing in his mind. Who was he really? The thought circled his mind, growing more persistent with each passing moment. He couldn't help but feel that the encounter wasn't just a coincidence. Maybe there was more to this man than met the eye. The next day, Rich went about his usual routine. Work was busy, filled with meetings and deals to close, and soon enough, he pushed the strange encounter out of his mind. But deep down, there was a nagging curiosity that wouldn't go away. He kept asking himself, what did I miss? At lunch, Rich decided to take a walk through the park, as he often did when he needed a break from the office. The sun was shining brightly, and the park was filled with families enjoying the warm day. As he strolled along the path, his thoughts wandered back to the homeless man. What if the man had been trying to tell him something? Maybe there was a deeper meaning to their brief interaction. Suddenly, Rich froze in his tracks. His eyes widened as he saw the same man from the cafe, sitting on a bench across the park. This time, he wasn't wearing the fine suit. He was back to his tattered clothes, the ones Rich had first seen him in. But he wasn't slouched over, begging for change. He was sitting upright, his face calm, his gaze intense. The homeless man noticed Rich immediately. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, it felt as if the whole world had stopped. Rich couldn't explain why, but he felt a sense of urgency, like he needed to approach the man, like something important was about to happen. Taking a deep breath, Rich made his way over to the bench. The man didn't say anything at first, just looked at him with those same steady eyes. "Hi," Rich finally said, his voice uncertain. "We met yesterday. You were in the cafe." The homeless man nodded but didn't speak. There was a long pause, and Rich felt a bit awkward. He wasn't used to this kind of interaction, especially with someone he had dismissed so easily the day before. I don't know why I'm here," Rich confessed, "but I keep thinking about what happened yesterday. I don't get it. Why did you look at me like that? You seemed so different." The man's expression softened, and after a moment of silence, he spoke. "I know you're confused, but sometimes it takes a wake-up call to see the truth." Rich felt a knot form in his stomach. There was something about the man's voice, calm, but with a weight of wisdom behind it, that made him feel small. He shifted uncomfortably on the bench. "I don't understand," Rich said. "You were just a homeless man. But now, you're acting like you know something I don't." The man smiled gently, though his eyes were serious. "It's not about the clothes or the place you're sitting. It's about who you are inside. You see, I've been in your shoes before. I know what it's like to look down on others, to think that you're better than them because of what you have. But that kind of thinking only keeps you blind to the truth." Rich's mind raced. This was not the conversation he had expected. What was this man trying to say? You think you've worked harder than everyone else, that your success means you're superior, the man continued. But the truth is, none of that matters. What matters is the kind of person you are, the way you treat others, the way you see them. The man you look down on today might be the one who saves you tomorrow." Rich was silent. His heart pounded in his chest. The words hit him harder than he had expected. He had always prided himself on being successful, on working his way to the top. But suddenly, he realized that the man was right. His wealth, his status, none of it defined him. It was just a mask, something to hide behind. The homeless man stood up slowly and looked down at Rich. "I'm not here to make you feel guilty. I'm here to make you think. Think about the people you pass by every day, the ones you ignore, the ones you consider beneath you. What if you've been wrong all along?" Rich sat there, stunned. He had never thought about things like this before. In his world, success was everything, and the people who didn't have it were simply failures. But now, as he listened to this man, he realized just how narrowed his view had been. The man looked down at him one last time, his eyes full of understanding. "I've been where you are. I've learned the hard way. But it's not too late for you to change. You just have to open your eyes." With that, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Rich sat on the bench, his mind spinning. He was shaken, but something inside him had shifted. For the first time, he started to question everything he had believed about success, power, and the people he had once thought of as beneath him. As the sun began to set, Rich stayed on the bench, thinking. This was only the beginning of a journey he hadn't expected, and he had no idea how much it would change his life. A moment of reflection. The next morning, Rich woke up earlier than usual. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt this restless. The words of the homeless man from the day before replayed over and over in his mind. What if you've been wrong all along? He couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside him. His whole life had been centered around his work, his wealth, and his status. But now, he was questioning everything he had ever believed in. As he stood in front of the mirror, getting ready for his usual day, he looked at his reflection with a new sense of unease. He had always been proud of his success, his polished appearance, his life of luxury. But now, looking at himself, it felt hollow. Was this who he really was? Or was it just a mask he had put on to hide the emptiness inside? The encounter with the homeless man had opened something deep within him, a door to a side of life he had never truly considered. He thought back to the way he had treated people like the homeless man, always dismissing them as invisible, unimportant. Now he wondered if he had been blind all along, unable to see the true value in the people around him. Was his wealth and success really the measure of who he was? That afternoon, Rich had a meeting with some colleagues. As they sat around a conference table, discussing a new business deal, his mind kept wandering back to the homeless man. He couldn't focus on the numbers, the projections, or the profits. All he could think about was the way the man had looked at him. That calm, knowing gaze that seemed to see right through him, to the heart of his soul. For the first time in years, Rich felt an overwhelming sense of guilt. He realized how much he had been taking for granted, how easy it had been to dismiss others. What had he done to help those in need? Nothing, really. He had always assumed that his success was enough, that it made him better than people who had less. But now he wasn't so sure. As the meeting ended, Rich found himself staring out the window of his office, lost in thought. His eyes wandered across the busy street below, where people walked by, each of them living their own story, their own struggle. Some were heading to work, others were rushing to get home. And then, there were the people who had no place to go, the ones Rich had always looked past, too focused on his own world to notice theirs. It was then that he had an idea, a thought so simple, yet so profound, that it almost shocked him. What if he did something different? What if he made a real change? He didn't know exactly what that change would look like, but he was certain that it was time to stop living his life on autopilot. He needed to learn more about the people he had been ignoring. He needed to listen to their stories, understand their struggles, and perhaps do something to help. It wasn't about charity or pity. It was about seeing people for who they truly were, human beings with hopes, dreams, and dignity. The more Rich thought about it, the more he felt an overwhelming desire to make things right. He had been wrong to judge people based on what they had or didn't have. It was time to change his perspective, to stop being the man he had been and start becoming the man he could be. That evening after work, Rich went to a local community center he had passed by countless times, but never stopped at. It was a modest place, filled with people who were struggling, but there was something about it that felt different to him now. As he entered, he was greeted by a few volunteers who seemed surprised to see someone like him walking through the door. "Can I help you?" one of them asked, her voice kind but cautious. Rich hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say. "I've been thinking a lot," he began, "about the way I've been living my life. And I want to learn more about what's really going on in this world, especially with people who don't have the things I take for granted. I want to help in any way I can." The volunteer smiled, clearly relieved by his sincerity. "Well, we always need help around here. There's so much we do for people in need, and it takes a lot of hands to make a difference. Would you like to join us? We have a program for people who want to give back to the community." Rich nodded. "Yes, I'd like that very much." As he left the community center that evening, Rich felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of his wealth and success pushing him forward. Instead, he felt like he was finally on the path to becoming a better person. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He was ready to make a change. The turning point. Rich woke up the next morning feeling different. There was no excitement over his usual routine, no thrill at the thought of his successful business meetings or high-status events. All of that seemed so distant now. Instead, his thoughts were consumed by the faces of the people he had seen the night before at the community center. Their lives, their struggles, their stories. It was so much more than he had ever considered before. As he sat in his sleek apartment, sipping his morning coffee, Rich couldn't help but feel a growing sense of urgency. His life had been focused on gaining more, achieving more, but for what? Was it all just to show off? To be admired? To feel superior? The more he thought about it, the more hollow it seemed. He had achieved success in his career, but his personal life, his understanding of the world, was still so narrow. He remembered the homeless man. The way he had spoken to Rich, calm and wise beyond his years. The words echoed in Rich's mind. What if you've been wrong all along? Was it possible that everything he had built, everything he had worked for, wasn't enough? Was it even worth it? As the day went on, Rich found himself drawn to the community center once again. This time, he knew he wasn't just visiting out of curiosity. He was there because he wanted to make a real change. He needed to understand what he could do to make things right, to help people who had been forgotten by society. He arrived at the center in the afternoon. As soon as he stepped inside, he was greeted by the same volunteer from the night before. Her name was Sarah, and she had a welcoming smile that immediately put him at ease. "Good to see you back," she said with a warm smile. "Are you ready to get started?" Rich nodded, feeling a sense of determination building within him. "I'm ready," he said. "I want to help however I can." Sarah led him to a small group of volunteers who were preparing meals for the homeless in the area. Rich rolled up his sleeves and got to work. At first, he felt out of place. The kitchen was small and cramped. The people around him were all busy, and there was a certain level of urgency that he wasn't used to. But as the hours passed, he began to see the difference this work made. Every meal they prepared, every hand they extended, mattered. Later that evening, as the team packed up for the night, Sarah pulled Rich aside. "You did great today," she said. "We could use more people like you here, but this is just the beginning. There's a lot more you can do if you're really committed to making a change." Rich listened intently. "I want to do more. I don't want to just show up and feel good for a day. I want to make a real difference." She smiled, her eyes sparkling with understanding. "That's the spirit. We have a program where people can get involved more deeply. You can mentor others, help raise awareness, and work directly with the people in need. It's not easy, but it's rewarding." Rich took a deep breath. He wasn't sure exactly what all of this would look like, but he knew one thing for sure. He wanted to give more than just his time. He wanted to give his heart, his energy, and his voice to something greater than himself. The next day, Rich arrived early at the community center, ready to take on his new role. He felt a sense of purpose that he had never experienced before. There was no rush to get to a meeting, no need to impress anyone with his success. All that mattered now was being present, being involved, and making a tangible difference. The first person he helped was a woman named Jessica. She was in her late 30s, with 2 small children in tow. Jessica had been living on the streets for over a year after losing her job and her home. She was doing her best to get back on her feet, but it wasn't easy. Rich sat down with her, listened to her story, and helped her fill out job applications. "It's not much," he said, looking at the pile of paperwork, "but it's a start. Let's see what we can do together." Jessica smiled, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. Rich's heart warmed as he saw the impact of his small gesture. It wasn't about handing her money or making a grand donation. It was about taking the time to listen and help where it was needed most. This, he realized, was what true success looked like, using what he had to lift others up. As the day drew to a close, Rich left the community center feeling a sense of fulfillment that no business deal had ever given him. The work wasn't easy, but it was meaningful. He had made a difference in someone's life, and that was more important than anything he had ever accomplished in the business world. Later that evening, as Rich sat alone in his apartment, he reflected on the journey he had started. He knew that his life would never be the same again. The encounter with the homeless man had been a wake-up call, but it was only the beginning. There was still so much more to learn, so much more to do. Rich had finally come to understand that his wealth wasn't what defined him. It was his ability to change lives and make a real impact that mattered. The unexpected call. Rich woke up to an unfamiliar feeling the next morning. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of clarity. The doubts that had clouded his mind over the past few weeks were slowly fading. He was no longer just a wealthy businessman rushing from one meeting to the next, trying to impress people and accumulate more. He was someone who had discovered a deeper purpose, a sense of responsibility for the people around him. As he made his morning coffee, he couldn't help but think of the people he had met over the last few days at the community center. There was Jessica, the woman with 2 young children trying to rebuild her life after everything had fallen apart. There was Steve, an older man who had been living on the streets for years, but was still fighting for a chance to get back on his feet. Their stories touched Rich in a way he couldn't explain. It made him realize just how much he had taken his life for granted. It was then that he received an unexpected phone call. Mr. Rich Davis. The voice on the other end was calm, but it carried an urgency that made Rich sit up straighter. "This is Detective Carter from the local police department. I'm afraid I need to speak with you about something serious. Do you have a moment?" Rich's mind raced. He had no idea what this was about, but his gut told him it wasn't good. "Of course. What's this about?" "There's a homeless man named Henry Walker," Detective Carter began. "He's been found in a severe condition outside of the community center you've been visiting. We have reason to believe that he was assaulted last night. We need to speak with anyone who may have been around or could have seen anything." Rich's heart sank. Henry Walker. That was the same homeless man who had spoken to him so kindly, the one who had changed his life with a few simple words. Rich's thoughts immediately flashed back to the night he had seen Henry, his calm demeanor, his wisdom, and that brief, powerful exchange. I know him," Rich said, his voice unsteady. "I've been helping at the community center. I've spoken to him. I didn't know he was in trouble." "We believe he may have been attacked," Detective Carter replied. "We just want to make sure we gather all the information possible. We'll need you to come down to the station and give a statement." "I'll be there," Rich said without hesitation. When Rich arrived at the police station, he was immediately escorted into an interrogation room. Detective Carter was there waiting for him, along with another officer. The room was dimly lit, and the tension in the air was thick. Rich felt his palms sweat as he sat down, trying to focus. His mind was racing with questions. Why would anyone attack Henry? What had happened? Detective Carter wasted no time. "Mr. Davis, we understand that you've been helping out at the community center recently. Can you tell us if you saw anything unusual last night?" Rich shook his head. "No, nothing unusual. But I spoke to Henry for a few minutes. He seemed fine, just like always. I had no idea anything was wrong." The officer across from him scribbled something on a notepad, then looked up at Rich. Did Henry seem afraid of anyone? Anyone who might have been threatening him? Rich paused. He thought back to their conversations, but nothing stood out. No, he never seemed afraid. He's always been calm, wise. He just wanted to help the others who were in need. The detective leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You're sure there was nothing unusual? No one acting suspiciously around him?" Rich hesitated. The truth was, he hadn't really paid attention to anyone else that night. He had been so focused on his own transformation, on his own awakening, that he hadn't noticed if there was anything strange going on around him. But something in the back of his mind gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. Henry's kindness, his wisdom, and the way he had treated Rich. There had to be something deeper. He wasn't just a homeless man. He was someone with knowledge, someone who had seen the worst of life and still managed to hold on to hope. But why would anyone want to hurt him? "Is Henry okay?" Rich asked, his voice quieter now. "Is he going to be all right?" Detective Carter didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, eyes studying Rich carefully. Finally, he spoke. "He's in critical condition, Mr. Davis. We're doing everything we can, but we don't know what will happen. We'll keep you updated." Rich's heart sank even further. He wanted to do more. He wanted to help Henry, but what could he do now? All he could think about was the kindness Henry had shown him, and the lessons he had learned in such a short time. If Henry didn't make it, would Rich ever truly understand the message he had been sent? As he left the police station, Rich's mind was a whirlwind of confusion and concern. The reality of the situation hit him like a ton of bricks. Henry, the man who had shown him a new way of thinking, was fighting for his life. Rich didn't know what had happened, but he couldn't sit back and do nothing. He needed to find out the truth. This wasn't just about helping at the community center anymore. This was about something much bigger, a fight for justice, a fight for the people who had been forgotten by society. And Rich was determined to do whatever it took to make sure Henry's voice was heard, no matter what. The investigation unfolds. Rich's mind was in turmoil as he drove home that evening. The news of Henry's condition weighed heavily on him, but something else was gnawing at him, something that didn't make sense. Henry had been hurt, but why? Who would want to harm a man who had done nothing but show kindness? The more Rich thought about it, the more questions seemed to arise, and the more he realized that the truth was still out of reach. The police had told him they would keep him updated, but as the hours passed, Rich couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to be involved more directly. He couldn't just wait for the authorities to figure it out. Henry had trusted him, and now it was his turn to return that trust. The next day, Rich made a decision. He would visit the community center again, not just to volunteer, but to look for clues. Maybe there was something he had missed, some detail that would lead him to the answers he so desperately needed. When Rich walked through the doors of the community center, he was met by Jessica, the young woman he had met a few days ago. She was sitting behind the counter, helping people sign up for the day's services. She looked up and smiled, but the smile faded when she saw the look on Rich's face. "Mr. Davis, is everything okay?" she asked, her voice full of concern. Rich nodded but didn't speak at first. He was scanning the room, noticing everything. The people sitting quietly in the corners, the noise of children playing in the back, the hum of daily life. It seemed so normal, so peaceful, and yet Henry's absence was painfully evident. Rich felt the weight of the center's purpose and its impact on the community. It wasn't just a place of shelter, it was a lifeline. "I need to speak to Steve," Rich said suddenly, his mind now focused. Steve was one of the regulars at the center, an older man who had been living on the streets for years. He had always been quiet, but Rich had gotten the sense that Steve knew more than he let on. "Steve?" Jessica asked, looking around. "He's outside, near the back. But Mr. Davis, I have to warn you. He's a bit touchy today. He's been acting strange since last night." "Touchy?" Rich asked, feeling a mix of curiosity and concern. "What happened last night?" Jessica lowered her voice. "I'm not sure, but he seemed upset after hearing about Henry. He's always been protective of the people here, and after what happened, well, he just hasn't been the same." Rich felt his heart race. Steve could be the key to understanding what had happened to Henry. Maybe he had seen something. Maybe he knew something that no one else did. Rich made his way to the back of the center, where Steve was sitting alone on a bench. The older man's back was hunched, and he was staring off into the distance, lost in thought. As Rich approached, Steve didn't look up. "Steve," Rich said gently, taking a seat beside him. "It's Rich. I wanted to talk to you." Steve didn't respond at first. Then, after a long silence, he finally spoke, his voice heavy. "I heard what happened to Henry. He didn't deserve that." Rich nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. "I know. That's why I'm here. Do you know anything? Did you see anything unusual last night?" Steve hesitated, his hands trembling slightly as he looked down at them. "I didn't see much, but I heard something. Someone came by last night, a man I didn't recognize. He was yelling at Henry. I tried to step in, but Henry told me to stay out of it." Rich's pulse quickened. What was he saying? "Do you remember anything the man said?" Steve closed his eyes, trying to recall the events. It was about respect. About people like Henry taking up space that didn't belong to them. The man said he didn't want his city filled with people like Henry. Rich's blood ran cold. "You're telling me someone came here and threatened Henry? Why?" Steve shrugged, his eyes haunted. "I don't know, but I could see it in the man's eyes. He didn't care. Henry tried to talk to him, but I think it only made it worse." Rich sat back, trying to process what Steve had said. A wealthy man, someone who thought of himself as above others, had shown up and threatened Henry. That couldn't be a coincidence. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but they didn't make sense yet. Why would anyone attack Henry after a conversation like that? "Did you see the man leave?" Rich asked, still hoping for more clues. Steve shook his head slowly. "No, I didn't see him leave. But Henry seemed to be okay, at least when he left. He didn't act like he was in danger. He just told me to stay out of it, that it was fine." Rich's mind was spinning. He had learned something crucial. The man who had attacked Henry wasn't a random stranger. This was someone who had a clear agenda, someone who saw themselves as superior to people like Henry. But why target him specifically? What had Henry done to deserve this? "I have to go to the police," Rich said finally, standing up. "We have to make sure they know everything you just told me. This isn't just some random attack. It's bigger than that." Steve nodded but didn't say anything more. Rich could tell that the conversation had drained him. The weight of knowing that someone had been targeting Henry, and now possibly others, was more than Steve could bear. As Rich walked away from the community center, his thoughts were racing. Steve had given him a vital piece of the puzzle, but there was still so much to uncover. Who was this man that had attacked Henry, and why? And how far would Rich be willing to go to make sure justice was served? This wasn't just about a homeless man being assaulted. It was about the growing divide between the wealthy and the less fortunate, and the deep-rooted prejudice that had allowed such acts to happen. Rich knew he couldn't back down now. He had to keep going, no matter what the cost. The shocking revelation. The next few days felt like a blur. Rich was consumed with the investigation, unable to think about anything else but finding the truth. He had gone to the police, provided them with the information Steve had given him, and now he was waiting for them to act. But nothing was happening fast enough. Every hour that passed felt like an eternity. Then, just as he was starting to feel hopeless, he received a call that changed everything. It was from Detective Williams, the lead investigator on Henry's case. The detective's voice was calm but urgent as he spoke. "Rich, we've got something. It's not good." Rich's stomach tightened. "What's happened? What did you find?" "We've tracked down the man who attacked Henry," Detective Williams continued. "His name is James Hunter. He's a well-known businessman, wealthy and powerful. He owns several high-end properties around the city." Rich's heart sank. The man who had threatened Henry, the man who had caused him so much pain, wasn't some random stranger. It was a man who thought he was above everyone else, someone who had everything but still felt entitled to hurt others. "How did you find him?" Rich asked, his voice tight with anticipation. "We got a tip from one of Hunter's employees. Apparently, he's been harboring some very extreme views about the homeless and anyone he considers beneath him. After we started digging, we found out that Hunter had been visiting the area where Henry had been staying, watching him. He even made threats to a few of the people who lived there," the detective explained. Rich's mind was spinning. "You mean he's been targeting people like Henry for a while?" "Yes, and it gets worse. We also found out that Henry wasn't just any homeless man to him. Hunter had some sort of personal vendetta against Henry. It seems Henry had once worked for him years ago, but they had a falling out. Hunter blamed Henry for something that happened at one of his businesses, something that cost him a lot of money. He's been holding a grudge ever since." Rich couldn't believe what he was hearing. Henry had been a victim of Hunter's anger and resentment from years ago. And now, after all this time, it had boiled over into violence. The attack wasn't random. It was personal. "Is he in custody?" Rich asked, his voice trembling with a mix of relief and rage. "Not yet," the detective replied. "We're working on it. But we got enough evidence to press charges, and we're going to make sure he's held accountable." Rich's thoughts raced. This wasn't just about one man being attacked. This was about a deep-seated belief that some people were worth more than others, that some lives didn't matter. Hunter's wealth and power had given him the belief that he could do whatever he wanted, that he could treat people like Henry with contempt. But now, his actions were catching up with him. "I'll be there as soon as I can," Rich said, his voice determined. "This needs to be exposed. People need to know the truth about Hunter." Later that day, Rich found himself standing outside the police station, the weight of everything he had learned pressing down on him. He had seen the dark side of the city he had always believed was so beautiful and successful. He had seen how easy it was for the powerful to walk all over the powerless, to make people disappear, to erase their worth from the world. But now, he had the chance to make things right.